Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. In our next conversation with Dr. Cristina Rosetti, we're going to learn more about the major raids on fundamentalist Mormon communities in 1944 and 1953. You won't want to miss this conversation because we're also going to talk about the splits that happened between what became the Apostolic United Brethren and the FLDS Church. So it's an amazing conversation. You won't want to miss it.
Yeah, so he goes, in 1944, there was a raid in the community, and many prominent people go to prison in the raid. In both 1944 and 1953, both men and women go to prison. That's something a lot of people kind of forget about, that women go to prison too for polygamy.
Mm-hmm.
But
they're more going after the men than the women, aren't they?
They are, but women go to prison for polygamy. Women are fined. There are some great pictures of very cute, dressed up, fashionable, stylish women sitting in their prison cell, looking very proud of themselves for it. And I think that's I think that is something that is so important, is in this period, to go to prison for polygamy is to be persecuted for your religion. Mm-hmm. You're Joseph Smith.
Right.
And even in some way to be excommunicated for polygamy too at this time, for some of these people, it's a badge of honor.
Right.
Like that you were willing to lose everything. You were willing to even put your blessings on the line for the cause of God. You're making a lot of martyrs out of this. So 1944, he goes to prison. A lot of the leadership go to prison. And one of the things that happens in the prison that will eventually create early fissures in the fundamentalist movement is all of the men know that they can get out if they just sign a loyalty oath. And half of them decide to do it. And Musser's one of them. Musser signs the loyalty oath. And of course he
with
does.
no intention of being loyal.
He's never and he gets he's going to keep getting married. He's certainly going to keep telling people to get married. He has no intention of ever aligning himself with the church or with the state. But he signs the oath because this is a man who's a polygamist. He has a lot of wives, a lot of children. How are you going to support people if you're sitting in a cell? He also is running, they're all running a fundamentalist religion. They need to get out of prison. And so Musser signs it. He knows he's never going to live it. But some men, they were like, no, we're not going to be a Wilford Woodruff of another age. We're sitting in prison for the cause of God. And so this causes a lot of tension, that it becomes these men who were willing to cave, even though they still were polygamists, and the men who decided to stay. And you can sense that if you get out of prison later than your friends and you come strolling back into town, there's going to be a little bit of resentment that they all got out. So this will create fissures. And even today, a lot of people who grew up FLDS or grew up Centennial will kind of make comment of Musser who signed the oath, right? There's a little bit of hostility because they're men, the people who become the FLDS and Centennial Park did not sign the oath.
Okay, because I thought Brian told me a lot of those people were independent fundamentalists and not FLDS.
Yeah, so the notable people who didn't were Charles Zitting and Louis Kelch. Those were the big guns that didn't sign the oath. They also, so a couple things come together to create the major schism that will happen after the raid, the big raid, which we'll come back to. After the raid, a couple major significant questions. What does the president of the priesthood do? Do you oversee eternal matters, or do you also oversee temporal matters? What do you do? And slowly, people are starting to sign over their property. People are starting to do consecration. There's an interest in United Order. The United Effort Plan starts. And some men, Louis Kelch and Charles Zitting, say, we're not signing over our stuff. We signed up to keep polygamy alive until the end of the age and nothing more. We're not
forming a new church.
We signed up for one thing. Those two men also were like, you all signed what's going on? Like, you all caved? No. So that becomes a problem. And those two, especially Lewis Kelch is really kind of seen as the father of the independent movement because of that idea. He was like, I signed up for polygamy. I signed up to believe in the restoration and to keep it going, and I didn't sign up for anything else. And so a lot of independents will similarly say, we're doing polygamy. That's it, just like Lewis Kelch did. Zitting similarly was deeply concerned with how the temporal affairs were working. So that becomes a problem.
So a lot of these people, because I know there's been a fundamentalist belief that, hey, go join the LDS church, get baptized, serve a mission, get your endowment, get sealed to your first wife, and then come back to us.
That was really trendy in the 60s and 70s.
Right.
And the 80s. I think I don't see that. So, and I mean, I've talked a lot about that was a thing that happened. I would make the argument, I mean, and nothing was set in stone. I would make the argument that that's dying off. I think that's a particular...
because of the 1978 revelation.
I think 1978, but also the endowment changed again recently. And so I think that the idea of stay LDS, have your kids go to primary, whatever, I think that's a fundamentalism of a particular generation. And I think like the millennial I think that's like a Gen X boomer way of being a fundamentalist. I think the millennial generation are just like, no, we're fundamentalists. Like, we're just going to be what we are. So I think that I think more and more now we're starting to see that there actually is kind of a generational divide on how to be a fundamentalist.
Okay.
But I think that story is still to be told. I don't want to make a definitive claim on that.
Well, that was my question. So the ones who refused to sign the loyalty oath in 35 or whatever.
44, yeah.
44. Oh, 44. Okay. They became both independents. That's the Lewis Kelch.
Charles Zitting.
Charles Zitting. So they're kind of the independents. And then they're also kind of the FLDS. Is that right?
And yeah, so the big split. So real quick, there's a raid in 1953. The 1953 raid.
Well, there's a 51 split too.
Well, so the fissures that the 51 split is kind of 51, 52. It's an ongoing thing. The 53 raid is really kind of a defining moment because that puts a line in the sand of who was there for that.
Yeah.
Like who lived through the raid.
And so that was interesting because we went there and there was a big schoolhouse. I did a little short. I don't know if you knew that. Like, this is where it was. And so this is the one I think for
bust. Like
what's that? Yeah.
That's where all the children were bussed away.
For us modern people, in fact, I even told a friend this recently. You remember the Texas raid where they were separating mothers and children and everything, and it was a big mess. That's the 53 raid, basically.
Yeah.
They're putting children and mothers on buses.
153 children were taken. And I mentioned this yesterday at the tour, but it just needs to be repeated that monogamous children were taken. Like, children of monogamous parents were taken. So when people come in, there's an assumption between both Arizona and Utah that there's an overarching assumption that if you're in Short Creek, you're a polygamist, because that's the perception from the media. It's the perception from everyone. And so just children are taken. It doesn't matter who your parents are. It doesn't matter anything. And a lot of those kids never returned.
Okay.
They were put in foster and they were just shipped off to Arizona.
And so Short Creek was intentionally put on the Utah-Arizona border.
Yeah.
So that if the Arizona people came, you just go to Utah, like literally cross the street. And vice versa. If the Utah people came, you go to Arizona. And so when they did this 53 raid, the Utah and Arizona justice systems coordinated so that they could get everybody.
And they come in, like, it's dark. Like, it's dark. And, I mean, and it was interesting because it was dark, and yet the fundamentalists knew it was coming. They knew. I mean, they knew, but they couldn't save their children, which is even kind of a more traumatic reality. But all the men kind of knew, and they were like, we'll notify, they get the kids and we'll notify you. We'll tell you, you'll know. And like there's TNT that goes off as like a sign that the ATF is coming in. It's like this big.
So it's the federal government too. It's not just Utah and Arizona.
ATF. And ATF is always there. When has ATF ever done a good job at a raid on a religion? Well, Waco, really successful. Am I right?
Yeah. Were they involved in the FLDS raid too?
Yeah, ATF. Yeah.
Yeah.
Alcohol, tobacco, and firearms is a necessary component of a raid on a religious community. I said this yesterday. When has a federal raid on a religion ever succeeded in doing its job and not creating
a problem?
More of a problem.
Yeah.
And so, 1953 was a traumatic raid for people, and it was deeply remembered. It caused a lot of retrenchment. A lot of people took their kids out of school. People started working from home. It created a lot of the isolation that Short Creek is today known for. In later years, Warren Jeffs ends up weaponizing it. There's a lot of talks of him telling children to close their eyes and imagine being taken. And
in the middle of the night.
In the middle of the night. And so he's creating a culture of fear and isolation. And that isolationism, if you weren't in Short Creek, if you weren't there for the raid, you don't feel that. And so this is part of the reason why there eventually is such a different kind of experience of being a fundamentalist in northern Utah. But when there is a split that happens in the communities because of the loyalty oaths, because of the question of what does the president of the priesthood do, they're also around this time in Short Creek. John Y. Barlow's the guy in Short Creek at this point. J. Leslie Woolley has died. J. Leslie Broadbent has died, and Barlow is now the leader of the community. And he was the head of the community for everyone, even for Musser because Musser never lived in Short Creek. Musser lived in northern Utah, and even for Musser, Barlow was the guy. Even though we have one instance where Joseph Musser is a little annoyed at how the property was working, and he goes to Barlow with Lewis Kelch, the guy that creates the independent movement, and he goes to Barlow and he's just like, "Do you have the keys? Do you?" And Barlow says no. And so that's a little weird, but, and Brian Buchanan, everyone, people who are part of the Short Creek group would say, well, of course Musser's going to say that. But Musser remains faithful to Barlow. But the problem is with all of these issues, and then under Barlow as well, this is when we start to see placement marriage. It's also when we start to see pretty young marriages, but placement marriage especially. And so
Barlow, Brian told me, is a real autocrat. I'm tired of this committee stuff. What I say goes.
Yeah, we start to see event under Barlow when we start to see the slow shift to one-man rule. Now, that won't be fully solidified until Barlow's successor dies and Rulon takes power, and that's kind of really when it's known as being one-man rule. But up until Barlow, there's a council. Council decides together, this is how it's going to be. And slowly under Barlow, how do you get 5 people to vote on the same thing perfectly all the time?
Right.
You know what's easier? Doing it yourself. It's going to be easier. How do you get what are you going to do? And so we start to see the slow shift, and placement marriage is really kind of an obvious visual of this guy is deciding who's going to marry who in the town.
So he's the matchmaker.
So he becomes, and we start to see a lot of particular instances. Marianne Watson has a really great article that she wrote for, was it Dialogue or MHA or JMH? I don't remember, but a great article called The History of Placement Marriage. And she documents the earliest instances of this. It's a really fantastic article that I highly recommend for people interested in FLDS marriage. Joseph Musser becomes concerned by this eventually. And all of this will eventually create the split. And the split will be along the lines of what happens when Barlow dies. What do we do?
Does he die in 51?
So John Y. Barlow dies in 1949. But by this time, the problem with this is Joseph Musser doesn't live there. Joseph Musser has never lived there. These people have undergone the 44 raid. These people have undergone their churches dissolving and reincorporating. This community has undergone a lot. They're gathering there. The United Effort Plan has started. They're trying to live United Order. Where is Joseph Musser?
He's up in Salt Lake.
He's up in Salt Lake. He's just living in Salt Lake. And the priesthood house is up there, and they do a lot of meetings up there, but he's not living down there. And there are fundamentalists in northern Utah. But because of this, we start to see Musser is the leader. He's the president of the priesthood because of his order in the priesthood council, because of his seniority. But we start to see a group kind of coalesce around Leroy S. Johnson. And we also start to see a group of people kind of really coalesce around Joseph Musser.
Okay.
And so we start to see the early
And they're both
fissure.
pretty charismatic leaders, right?
Yeah, and I mean, Leroy S. Johnson is dearly beloved, but they're charismatic for, I would say, different reasons. Leroy S. Johnson is charismatic in that he's one of the guys. He's in the town. He's a farmer. He's a believer in this. He's captivating. He's in close proximity, and that cannot be understated. He's approachable. He's one of the people in a very real way, and that means a lot to a community that is struggling. Joseph Musser is captivating because he wrote all of the documents, because he's been there since the beginning. He was part of the original priesthood council. Leroy Johnson wasn't part of the original council under Woolley. And so they're interesting and compelling for different reasons, but they're both interesting and compelling people. So we start to see this early, it's not formal, super formal yet, but we start to see this slow problem. Things become a big problem, though. It becomes like a final problem when Joseph Musser has a stroke. And he has a stroke, and there's this guy who's his doctor, who's a great guy.
It's not Russell M. Nelson.
It's not, unfortunately, Russell Marion Nelson. It is Rulon C Allred, the one and only. And Rulon C Allred was a fundamentalist. He was a polygamist. He was he was on like Time magazine. Like, he was like interesting. And eventually,
He's super charismatic.
yeah, he's a doctor. He's like suave. He has like a lot of really like modern, hip, cool wives. He has a lot of really cute kids who have like their hair done really well. They're like, he's in Salt Lake. He's
Cool.
He's the original poster child for the fundamentalist movement. Like and it makes sense. And he also has, he hasn't been around as long as the rest of the guys, but he did the work. He went to Mexico. John Y. Barlow sent him to Mexico to seal people. John Y. Barlow sent him on a mission. Like, he did a lot of work in Mexico. He set the stage for some later developments in Mexico between the priesthood council group and eventually the LeBaron group. He did a lot of on the ground work, and then he was also smart and charismatic and interesting and had a cute family, and so Musser ordains him as second elder, which means you're next in line. Now, to put him next in line meant to circumvent everyone else who had been around. And by everyone else, it means to circumvent Charles Zitting, one of the original members of the priesthood council that Woolley ordained. It meant to circumvent Musser's own son, who was ride or die for the movement. Like, it's one thing to be like, this guy's fit for the job. It's another to do it at the expense of someone you sat in prison with who was ordained by Lorne Woolley with you.
Yeah.
Zitting has a right to be a little annoyed by the whole thing. The biggest opponent to it was one of the biggest opponents was Guy Musser, Joseph's son. Guy Musser goes as far as to say that his father is actually, because of the stroke, is not fit to ordain someone to be his successor.
Oh, wow.
Which is a bold move, but...
Up to now, had they been pretty much following seniority?
Yeah. Next in line for seniority was the president of the priesthood.
And so Rulon Allred really messes up things.
This was a break in tradition. And so when Rulon is sustained a lot, Charles Zitting doesn't sustain him.
Okay.
Like, the meeting happens and Charles Zitting is just like, absolutely not. Like, this is out of order.
I oppose.
They're like, this is out of order. That this is not correct. But Musser stands by it, and when Musser dies in 1954, Allred rises to power in northern Utah, and eventually he becomes the leader of the Apostolic United Brethren. And when that happens in southern Utah looks at this and says, no, like, we didn't have a say in this. where are you? Like, you still don't live here. Like, who are you people? Because in southern Utah, they're like, who's Rulon Allred?
Right.
Like, Charles Zitting, what's going on? Like, who are you? And like, if you still go down to Centennial Park, like, so many of the graves are Zitting grave. Like, these people live here. There's no Allred. Like, who's Allred? Like, what's going on? And so they circle the wagons around Leroy S. Johnson, and it splits. Never.
And he's known as Uncle Roy.
Uncle Roy. Never to be. And that is the split. The FLDS doesn't.
Is that
take
in 51 or 54?
It's like 51, 52.
Okay.
You see the hard split. But 54 is when Musser dies, and that's kind of because I take issue with saying the split before Musser's death, just because yes, there was a lot of problems with the council. Yes, they're not sustaining his successor. Yes, they're upset, but I think it's fair to wait until Musser dies, just because and then have Rulon take power. But I mean, the priesthood does split, but when we say split, it doesn't mean the religions separate. It means there's a split in the decision-making body of the priesthood, of how we're going to approach things and how we're going to approach the future. But the actual, when Musser dies, it's over.
And so this is essentially, so you put it at 1954.
Well, I wait until Musser dies.
Okay, and so Rulon Allred starts, or whatever. This is where the FLDS and the AUB basically break apart.
Yes, and both of them go a council route.
Yeah. Up until then, I was surprised to learn that it wasn't called the AUB or the Allred group or the Musser group or any other group. It was just the work.
The work.
I didn't know that. That was interesting.
Yep, the work, or Centennial Park sometimes refers to themselves as the second ward, and the Short Creek group as the first ward.
Oh.
And then the Nielsen Naylor group is the third ward. And so there's little wards. And so, when we did the tour, Shirley Draper and Danya Jessup talked about that they were part of the work of God.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't the FLDS. I mean, the FLDS as a religious entity under that name doesn't incorporate until 1991. So it's a very new religion.
Very late.
Very late. And I mean, 1970s for the AUB.
Right.
So they're very late. But the groups do split in terms of many things. And eventually the AUB will continue the council model. They do have a president of the priesthood, but they do continue the council model. Whereas eventually over time, the FLDS and the Short Creek group really becomes known for solidifying under one man. That's a highly controversial.
And that's Rulon Jeffs.
Rulon Warren. That's highly controversial. In 1986, especially controversial. Two men, Alma Timpson and Marion and Hammond, come forward and they're like, this is absolute nonsense. Like, this is a dictatorship. This is not correct. And they jump ship and they take a group and they become Centennial Park that want to have a council.
Which is the second ward.
The second ward. And so we start to see splintering around that time between the groups. So, I mean, from then, I would say from the time Musser dies, the fundamentalist movement is never unified again.
Right. Well, and what about these independents? The Lewis Couch group, they were the ones who refused to sign this thing. I mean, they date to what, 44?
Well, so, I mean, many of them live in southern Utah. The divide with them is, are we going to sign over our property? Are we joining the United Order? And Lewis Kelchin doesn't join the United Order.
He doesn't want to.
No.
Okay.
And so you can live there for a time and not have joined. I mean, this ultimately will, under Rulon and certainly under Warren, that you have to join into the United Order. You have to be baptized into it under them. And that becomes a hallmark of the FLDS. But early on, you could live there, you're just not joining up on the things other than keeping the principle alive. So early movements of that in the 40s, and then we really kind of see people actually moving to live independently in the 70s, 80s.
Okay.
60s, 70s, 80s.
Because, and I remember, I think it was Danya Jessup said this yesterday, the largest fundamentalist group are independents, which are not really a group.
Yes. Yes, there are more independents than there are other people. Now, a lot of them, not a lot, but many of them will live in close proximity. So a lot of people who live at the Rock in Moab, they're independent, but it's a group of families that live together. And so sometimes people will think of them as maybe a group, but they're independent. They're not part of a unified church. They don't view themselves as a church.
So they don't have a council of friends or anything?
I don't know about the Rock specifically, but that is an example of families that live together, but they're independent. They're not a incorporated religion. And
do you know any independents that I can talk to? I guess Ann Wild's one, but I've talked to her already.
After we record, I can talk to you.
Yeah. That's fine. That's all I was looking for.
Yeah, there's a lot. But at the time when the split, over time, the Short Creek group was the large. Of course it was, because everyone was there. Like early on, this was the largest fundamentalist religion of Mormon fundamentalism. Once Warren comes to power, sends people away, things kind of go south. Because of all of this, the AUB today would be the biggest of the groups of the people that are a part of a church, and that is Musser's legacy.
Okay. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Cristina Rosetti. She's the author of Joseph Musser, a Mormon fundamentalist. In our next conversation, we're going to talk about the economic order of heaven, the Heavenly Mother's name, and we'll get into some amazing information on the Holy Ghost.
Who's that, Rick? What's the part of the Godhead whose name we don't know?
The Holy Ghost.
Yeah. But we do know his name.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you to continue to enjoy Gospel Tangents. Consider becoming a Patreon or go to gospeltangents.com/shop, and you can get a cool tie, a hat, or even a nice mug. You can also get a sweatshirt. So check it out at gospeltangents.com/shop.